Okay. Okay, welcome everyone to the fourth webinar organized by the Youth Disability and Advocacy and Research Network. I'm Katalin Brilla, Principal Lecturer in Film and TV at Bomas University. And for those who cannot see me, I'm a 44-year-old white male in glasses and white top, and I'm sitting in my home office. I have the pleasure to introduce a very special guest today who has done pioneering research in disability representation in media, Dr. Ngozi Emmanuel. She has recently completed a PhD in media and communication at Leicester University. She's a disability studies researcher, and her work focuses on the portrayal of disability in the media, as well as hate crimes against disabled people of ethnic minority groups. During this session, she will discuss a toolkit she created to support positive portrayals of disability in film, which has been adapted by filmmakers in countries of the global south, such as Nigeria. Before we start, please make sure you keep yourself muted during the presentation. I had to mute several people at the moment because there was a lot of background noise. So please keep yourself muted. The session will be quite interactive, so Ngozi will give cues when there is space to ask questions or to raise your hand. And feel also free to use the chats during the presentation, and we'll make sure to address your questions or comments afterwards. So I'm now handing over to Ngozi.
Thank you very much, Katalin, and welcome everybody. My name is Ngozi, like Katalin has introduced. I'm a 34-year-old Black female person living in Leicester. I'm going to start the presentation right away so that we have enough time for discussions, questions, experience sharing as well, and other interactions. Please let me know when you're able to see my screen.
Yeah, we've got it.
All right, good. So today I'm going to be sharing on portraying positive disability identity in films. That is mostly based on the toolkit that I developed between 2021 and so, like I said, the guide I'm presenting today in this discussion is from, groups of a couple of workshops that I held with disabled people in Leicester, the filmmakers and academics who work in the field of disability studies. Now, let me give a bit of a background about myself and why this area of research. This research interest has spanned over a decade for me as a young woman who lived in Nigeria, where we have over 35 million people with disabilities who are mostly put in the sidelines by the government and who are discriminated continuously against by the society, who do not seem to have awareness about abuse attitudes or that their discriminations are not right against disabled people. Following this, I had a 4-year research on disabilities and media, which I conducted at the University of Leicester. And beginning of this year, I worked as a postdoc, still researching on films, media, and disability that was funded by the ESRC IAA at the University of Leicester. So the talk we are going to have today, like I said, is based on the funded workshops, the workshops that I had from 2021 to 2023. And currently I'm working on my monograph, applying to research fundings, because there's a lot to do on disabilities and media, especially in global South countries, and also some research journal articles. I have a website that I created as the offshoot of my postdoc early this year. It's called disabilitiesandmedia.com. Catalin is going to share it in the comments, so you go there and have a read around some of the content of the website, and also have a read on the toolkit that is posted on there as well. Now, before I begin talking about the problems in film representation of disabled people, I wonder if anyone has any experience at all to share about, any film that they've watched with disabled characters in them, and what you think of, representation of disabled bodies in such film. Did you see any problem with film and disabled people? Anyone to share? You can put some ideas in the comment section as well.
Anyone would like to comment or put something in the chat? Yumna. Sorry,
Okay, someone says love.
Good afternoon.
Right, good
Hello.
afternoon.
On my side, in case of people with disability, I've observed them being portrayed negatively in a way that they are asking for protection as a pity. Someone where people should see him or her asking for pity, something like that. But also there's this cartoon animation Frozen one, where the main character Elsa is, some other kids are viewing Elsa as a person with albinism since she's white and has blonde hair. So there are children who portray children with albinism as Elsa. So they are seeing children with albinism like having superpowers like Elsa.
Mm-hmm.
I've read it in many articles from the internet. And I myself, as a person with albinism, someone told me that you look like Elsa.
Mm.
So disability and film industry, it's a place where we can use to change the narratives if we use it correctly. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Yumna. I agree with what you've said. Portraying disabled people from a place of pity is predominantly what many films, constructs the disabled body to be. Any other person before I continue?
I think Siobhan had her hand up.
Siobhan, hi.
Hi, yeah, just to say that my particular interest is the way people with dwarfism are represented on screen, and such an important area for research and discussion. Not only just that, for many years it's been an area that was usually seen as humorous and comical to the detriment of those with restricted growth conditions, but more recently we've seen a more positive change, which is now being confronted by the prospect of, for example, CGI and AI representations of people, which of course for many, that's causing great controversy because they're saying, well, what about our line of work? What do we do? So it's a really contested area, and one I find particularly interesting in terms of representation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you very much, Siobhan. I think the thing about people of small stature or people with restricted growth is also one of the things we talked about in the two workshops that led up to this toolkit. As we carry on with the discussion, you will see some of the recommendations that people made. Thank you very much. Now, apart from the problems that Siobhan had identified and that Yumna talked about, when we had the workshops, disabled people filmmakers and some academics identified, some of the problems in films. One of the problems they identified is the idea of the super creep or inspiration genre, where disabled people are made out to be, superhumans or tough or, absolute achievers. And one of the problems that they identified with this kind of genre in disability films is that this kind of genre puts a lot of pressure on disabled people, a pressure in the sense that they are put to the limelight and forced to want to achieve unimaginable things to prove their humanness. So they say for you to be accepted, according to this film genre, for you to be accepted in the committee of people, then you need to be inspirational, for example, as a disabled person. You need to have done something amazing, something, super, or probably you need to be rich to be an inspiration. So this is a problem that the participant identified as, one of the shortcomings or one of the flaws of disability inspiration in films. Another thing they identified is the representation of disabled people as better off dead. Sometimes you see in films where disability is portrayed as I'd rather be dead than disabled, in a sense that, contributes to the prejudice and discrimination against disabled people in society. Again, they identified representation of disabilities as objects, not subjects with a voice or a gentile person, but as objects that the non-disabled people need to stand on the gap for. So they identify people with disabilities as objects of charity, objects of pity, like Yomna mentioned, and objects of shame, the shaming of the disabled body as less than the non-disabled body. They also identified the film genre of disability as a burden, as a burden on the non-disabled people, as a burden that they can do without, just an unnecessary burden, in society. They also identified the evil avenger, the one who becomes disabled and wants to take revenge on the world. In this kind of genre, they see the common portrayals they've seen in films of disabled people are disabled people who are angry and unaccountable. So films make out disabilities to be, people who are angry with the world, who want to lash out at the world, who are uncomposed, who lack accountability because of their disabilities. They also identify disabled people as being their own worst enemies, as being sinister. And in the cinema that I analyzed in my PhD, there is a genre of evangelizing disabilities where films are, wield these tropes and these stories of how disabilities are curable, for example, by religion, by cultural, artifacts and all that. This could also be tied to the medicalization of disabilities on screen, where disabled characters or disabled actors are given the roles where, after acting in all of these roles, they are cured of their disabilities or they become non-disabled at the end of the film. Then there is also marketing of disabilities as humor, especially like Siobhan was talking about people with restricted growth being used in the comedy genre, make people laugh, put on a freak show. These are some of the problems that people identified in film representation of disabled people. Then they also talked about disabled mimicry, where non-disabled people are used to act disabled roles, and where disabilities are made to be like a prop or a tool that a non-disabled person can wear or fit into. This next slide is one of those films. It's a Nollywood film called Colorless, where both actors are not disabled, but both actors are seen in a wheelchair on the movie poster. So it's a reflection of what disabled mimicry is all about, where the non-disabled try to act out disabilities on screen. Now, how does this representation affect the audience who watch these films, the spectators who watch disability films? One of the areas we identified is in the area of encouraging or contributing or promoting the ableist gaze. Ableist gaze, according to what Lola and her colleagues defined it as, is a situation where the non-disabled gaze upon, disabilities and films as a spectacle. It's driven by curiosity and perceived as the right of the non-disabled to intrude into the private lives of disabled characters on screen. Now, sometimes disabled people themselves who are in the audience are caught in the crossfires, especially in a culture where there's internalized hierarchy of disabilities, where people feel one disability is better than the other disability. They are caught in the crossfire in that way, where they say, at least I am not in a wheelchair. At least I am not blind, for example. At least I can do this. My disability is not as bad as that. So they are also consuming disabilities in films from that, that counting oneself lucky perspective. I am fortunate not to be there. And this is ableism in all its ramifications. It is inquiring, it is, intruding into the lives of disabled people and consuming them as fun, as entertainment, as, this group within society that are just there as a nuisance, for example. Now, I see someone raising their hand. Please, you have your hand up.
Yeah, Ngozi, I have a question in relation to these problematic representations and also the impact on spectatorship.
Yeah.
Is your research, do you find that this also relates to, perhaps videos that are like not fictional, for instance, advertising, campaign videos, even maybe videos that might be produced by NGOs for some instances, etc.? Be interested in your thoughts on, in terms of that representation and some of those types that you mentioned earlier in relation to those types of videos. Thanks.
Yes, I do find commonalities in the films that I analyzed during my PhD and forms of advertising where disabled people are used in advertisement. But however, my research is not based on, advertising products and films, but then the problem is more broad. It can have you can look at it broadly to include, some of these things, because we watch some of these things, we see them on TV, and we see how, disabled bodies are represented on screen generally. And sometimes when, for example, disabled charities are fundraising, the sort of narrative that they use in their fundraising productions is more often than not based on pity. They sentimentalize even the film scores the instrumentals that go with these adverts in such a way that it pulls the audience in an ableist way, in a way of help, charity. It's like there is this hierarchy of we are non-disabled and we are supposed to help, pity the disabled person. So, like I said, disabled people are sometimes caught in the crossfires as well when ableist gaze is encouraged by the kind of content that they consume. Sometimes when we talk about ableism, for example, and ableist attitudes, we often naturally want to point towards non-disabled people. But then research has also shown that disabled people can also be ableist. They could also exhibit ableist characteristics and ableist attitudes, especially because in society, so much is being internalized about ableness and disabilities, that sometimes when we act out this way, or when we, react and offer, suggestions around the disabled body, we come off as being ableist without even intending to be ableist. But then I asked the question, is anti-ableist spectatorship possible? Is it possible for films to encourage or to contribute towards anti-ableist spectatorship amongst the audience? What do you think are the triggers or the indicators that a film could contribute towards, achieving anti-ableism, in the sense that when the audience consume or watch or view films about disabled people, for example, they will not be viewing disabled people in the ways of, for example, better off dead, as, objects of pity, as being a burden, as being sinister, or in a way that films do not mock disabilities when they try to mimic it. So how do you think films can achieve anti-ableist spectators? Anyone has any idea? Anyone?
Yvonne has her hand up. Yeah.
Me, thank you. Just one thing to consider that I hope would be seen is that we have more disabled people just playing the part of a character, that it's not contingent on their disability. Mm-hmm. That we have more representation in film and theatre, for example, where people just have the opportunity to play a part, rather than having, being forced into that position of having to represent a disabled person as such. I hope that this would go some way to making some significant change. Perhaps you can argue against me, I guess.
Yeah, that's good. I think it's also part of what the participants mentioned when we were trying to build a toolkit. Not just disabled people playing disabled characters, but they also wondered about, stereotyping disabled people to play disabled roles. So that, for example, a wheelchair user, an actor who is a wheelchair user, constantly plays the role of the wheelchair user in films. They also have a problem with that because it stereotypes them, and it means that disability is not accepted as a natural, integral aspect of filming. It means they are being separated and put aside to, simply act out their disabilities, so to say. So one of the things, like we come to see down the presentation, is that they want disabled actors to play normal roles, if there is anything like normal, because they also, one of the things we also argued about so much during the workshops was what is normal? Who defines normal? What indeed is the standard, if it is not what the media keep, feeding us with? So they also want, a situation where disabled characters are so integrated into the film process that it becomes natural and just, like an everyday thing to see different or varieties of disabilities on screen without having to single them out. Beth says it will be good to hire disabled actors, writers, directors, and film crew members, and that is the best way to combat ableist messages in films. I think that's also one of the recommendations that we have in the toolkit, about making sure that disabled people are part of the production process. That is one way of, combating ableist messages in films as well. Do you have your hand up, Kathleen?
Yes, I wanted to add something to this. I think one way of anti-ableist spectatorship is to make audiences have the perspective of people with disabilities, and show the lived experience, their lived experience. And that's often only possible if the filmmakers are either people with disabilities or they consult people with disabilities. So basically the lived experience from their perspective, not from a non-disabled person's perspective.
Good, exactly. And that is one of the things, that's also in the recommendation in the toolkit, about when people talk over disabled people as if they are not there. You need to be able to talk to them and involve them in practices and policy. What do they want? You need to have their voice represented, not have non-disabled people make decisions for disabled people. You need to make sure that they are able to say, what they want, how they want representation to be, which is one of the strengths of the toolkit that we developed, because we developed that in partnership with disabled people, filmmakers who have made films on disabilities, and academics as well, who research on disabilities and the media. Now, let's go into the toolkit proper and some of the key points from the toolkit. Now, we talked about the aspect of casting in films. And one of the points that was, mentioned during the workshops is disabled people first in disability films and productions, just like what Beth mentioned on the chat. They should be part of productions from, the crew to the cast. They have to be able to make decisions about how they want to be represented in films about themselves. Also, the use of disabled actors to play disabled roles. So we won't have the situation of disability or disabled mimicry, where non-disabled actors are used to play disabled roles in a way that we had previously before Black cinema, where, white actors and actresses are made to play Black people. And then you have this thing we call in literature the blackface, before we have the influx of Black cinema, and now Black people are able to play Black roles. Also, it's also in the aspect of the LGBTQI community as well. Previously, especially in cinemas like Nollywood, we had people who were not LGBTQI people acting out LGBTQI people in films, until the community says, no, we have our numbers, and people who play these roles should actually be members of the LGBTQI communities. Now, they talked about characters with disabilities being integrated into film as natural and integral difference, not casting disabled characters as something like an appendage to the storyline, but making them central in films, making them a big component of production that when people watch it, they will not see a difference as such. They will see disabilities as just a natural everyday thing, like race and color and any one of these things. Then they talked about research before casting. You need to know why you are casting someone in that role and whether they suit that role before you cast them, so that there won't be inauthentic storytelling, like Yomna said in the chat, so that there will be authenticity in the representation of disabled characters. They also mentioned about having disabled actors in lead and supporting roles across all genres of film production. Put them in the lead roles. They shouldn't just play the minor role all of the time. Let them be in the lead role. Let them also act in all genres of film, not just in films about disabilities, not just in films with themes of disability or disabled characters. Make them act in the horror genre, in the romance genre, across all genres of film. These are the ways of making disabilities an integrable difference. Integrable difference that I talk about is, for example, if I walk down the streets of Leicester, I won't have special looks for my color, because race or, in Britain, for example, has been so integrated that it's not a shock or a difference as such when people see people of other colors, for example. Same thing can happen with disabled people, so that people don't stare. There is a staring at disabilities that is in our communities. People stare at you in a way that is pervasive and intrusive, not in a way of admiration, for example, or, looking upon another human, but they look at you as, almost like an object that is out of place. But films can, integrate disabilities in storytelling, so that one of the ways it can contribute is people begin to see disabilities as an integrable difference in society. Now, we also talked about disability humor. That's one of the things we talked about, especially comedies. And one of the things that I found, especially in Nollywood cinema, is the use of disabled characters as comic relief in films. They use disabled characters as fillers or gaps to fill up the gaps in story, where people say, oh, this is a tragic film, for example. How do we relieve the tension? How do we build suspense, for example? Or let's throw in a disabled person to act out, to do something that will relieve narrative tension, for example. So what do the participants say about this? They say one of the things they mention is there should be no discriminatory language in films, in comedy films, for the sake of comedy. Not using discriminatory language in comedy films just because, oh, it's humor, just laugh it off. Also, like Siobhan was, talking about the other time about people of small stature, not using them as children in films for the sake of comedy. They are not children. They shouldn't play the role of children just for the sake of comedy or comic relief. And also, participants mentioned about not reproducing stereotypes about disabilities in films just because it's comedy. Because people taking a lot, or filmmakers taking a lot in the name of humor or in the name of, producing comedies. So they say, come on, it's comedy, but then you are reproducing stereotypes that advocates and even the law is trying so hard, to not have to repress, and you're reproducing them in films in the name of comedy. Now, they also talked about costuming. The kind of costume that disabled actors wear in films also matter as a way of portraying positive disability identity in films. One of the things they mentioned about is not using wheelchairs as prop. Does anyone have any question? Okay, not using wheelchairs as prop, for example, just like the film poster that I showed you. Wheelchair was basically used as a prop in that film poster. So they say only use wheelchairs where a movement calls for it. Now, they also mentioned about visually impaired, the blind. They say not all blind people wear dark glasses over their eyes. So don't make it a thing to always make them wear that in films. And also the use of proper guide canes for blind people. They should not always be led by the hand in films in a way that disempowers them and, you know, misrecognizes disability identity. Now, they also talked about film scores as advocacy tool. Film scores are the music or the sound that accompany films that we play in films, especially when they are original scores. So they say film scores or this music and instrumentals and sound in films should not have to be emotional or sentimental because the film is about disability. Because what this attracts or what this speaks to, it puts the audience in an ableist position where they are just, oh, this is so sad. You know, they sentimentalize disability and it makes it a sad event or, you know, being embodied with sadness. So they say, do not have emotional or sentimental scores shouldn't in films just because they are disabilities. Also, they talked about the inclusion of disabled crew members, like Beth mentioned, in scores about disabled people or disability films. People producing or creating the original scores should also be disabled people themselves. They will be able to tell better what sound is appropriate for each sense. Now, they also mention about not changing film scores for scenes because disabled characters are featured in them. It makes the narration sad. For example, the score has been upbeat in a film, for example, and then it gets to a scene where a wheelchair user is featured, and then the score changes, and then it gets sentimental and it gets emotional. It also appeals to ableism and calls to that, you know, disempowered identity that we are trying to fight in film representation. Now, one of the things we also talked about is the language of disabilities in films. Language matters, how disabled people are weaved into the dialogue. What they are called matters in films. Now, one of the things they mentioned about is not to identify disabled characters by their disabilities in films. For example, the blind boss, the blind parent, or the lover who is a wheelchair user. Just identify them by their role. They are a lover in that film. They are the boss in that film, for example. You do not have to identify the characters by their disabilities in dialogue. Also, do not refer to disabled characters as sick. Disabled characters are also not to be called strange in dialogue, whether it's for the sake of comic effect or whatever, they are not to be called strange. Disabled characters are not invalids. Invalid especially is one of the recurrent words I saw in my research in films, even in films as recent as 2019, where disabled characters are called invalids in dialogues. Also, do not use disability as a word of abuse For example, a character stumbles onto something or doesn't see something in a scene, and then you say to the character, "Are you blind?" Do not use disability as a word of abuse in films. Now, film titles about disabilities should not be sentimentalized. It should not be sentimental in a way that, diminishes the power of disabled people and misrecognizes disability as a positive identity. Now, I wonder if anyone wants to share experiences of, some of the films you've watched of recent, whether you think filmic characterization of disabilities or general representation of disabilities is changing now in 2023, for example, than it was in the early 2000s. Whether you have any questions around some of the recommendations that were made during the workshops. So over to you. Any experiences or questions?
You can put them in the chat if you want.
Yeah, you can, totally.
Someone is saying documentary is more progressive than fiction films in general.
Mm-hmm. I agree. Although in recent years, especially films like Hollywood, I think there was a research that Beth had done on progressive takes of Hollywood representation of disabilities. But then this research also found that they are still mostly patronizing as well in their progression. So what other things do you think should be done regarding films? Because one of the things that some of the participants mentioned about is people may not always read the news all the time. They may not always watch TV for TV's sake or news, but people more than often always watch films. People love a good story. So stories are important. So what other things do you think, can be done to improve on, a positive portrayal of disabilities on screen? Or if you have any recent experiences yourself?
Anyone would like to comment on that or share their experiences? So Yumna is saying in the chat, we also need to see people with disabilities in TV advertisement where they are also positively portrayed.
I agree, yes.
And we'll actually have a whole workshop on disability portrayal in advertising with Ella Houston in a few months.
Exactly. David talked about collaborating with writers with lived experiences. Yes, I think one of the core of critical disability studies, for example, is its emphasis on lived experiences, the importance of lived experiences. And in storytelling, in films as well, it's important because it supports a better story, supports a better narration when writers have lived experiences. They know how to better write, how to better, contribute to a positive representation of disabled people.
We have Siobhan with her hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that I think that film industry has a great deal to learn from live theatre. I've recently seen some really excellent productions, one by a company called Extraordinary Bodies, which is disabled actors and disabled production company, fully led, the writers, etc., and also a film, a play called The Fearless Benjamin Lay, in which a short-statured actor played the lead role, both of which were absolutely incredible and sort of more pioneering, I think, perhaps on stage than we're yet to see in film. That's my suggestion.
Siobhan, why would you think, I mean, what reason would you think, or would you ascribe to the fact that, theater productions are more progressive than fiction films? What could be the reason? Is it because theater productions are more real time, do you think? Or what do you think might be the reason for that, for better production in theater?
I don't know, it's a good question. Perhaps there's an opportunity to be braver. That perhaps then, I mean, maybe not quite so constrained by the expectations of marketing. I don't know the answer, but I'm merely suggesting that it's a place for film industry to take lessons.
Thank you. Anyone else? I think Dan talked about the political economies at play. Dan, do you care to shed more light on what you mean by political economies?
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, good. Sorry, I went to Bluetooth. What I mean is that if we compare theatre to Hollywood, let's say, totally different scale of commercial market orientation usually, and it's a relationship with, it's a relationship with the market. So Hollywood, most films there are designed to maximize the profit, and they don't even get commissioned unless that is likely. Whereas I don't know theatre as well, but I would suggest that there is a bit more, a bit less commercial orientation and a bit more freedom of those involved to experiment with genre, with storyline, and even the format and timing and things like that. So that's kind of what I meant by the political economies.
Yeah, I agree. I think even basically all cinemas, including Nollywood, that is fast emerging now, they are all constrained. Yeah, I would agree by political economy. And for Nollywood, this fact is complicated by the fact that the industry suffers, issues around piracy, for example, and which, kind of limits the profits that come in per film. So more often than not, they would go for what they think that the audience would want to see as a way of, maximizing profit for films.
Datius had a really interesting comment in the chat saying that there are obstacles of disabled people not going to acting school or studying film, and that's why there are so few script writers, actors with disabilities. So does this kind of stigma start even earlier in, for example, the educational sector or the media sector or the art sector?
I would say inequalities, for example, one of the research I'm working on now is educational inequalities, experiences of educational inequalities of disabled young people in West Africa. I think inequalities start right on time, and particularly because of the way society is structured, which I believe can change, because can society change? Yes, they can change. And one of the structures or one of the arms of society that are very contributory and, you know, formative to change are the media. And the media of film, for example, can contribute hugely to how society is transformed from ableism, you know, to exhibiting attitudes and behaviors that do not hinder or limit disabled people. So I believe some of these things are inherent in society itself, and somehow they translate onto the screen, onto the kind of films we watch, and onto how filmmakers make films. Because one of the arguments we had during the second workshop, for example, is that these filmmakers will make these films, will make these limiting, damaging, stereotypical films about disabilities. They are also a part of society. They are not separate from society. So some of the things that they portray, or some of the ways the stories that are written, are based upon their own biases and upon their own non-disabled experiences of disabilities in society. So that automatically or ultimately translate into the kind of films that they make. So I do believe they are all, you know, connected. And I do believe that when more disabled people are given opportunities in the creative act, for example, or in media, like someone mentioned about their interest in having more disabled journalists on TV. When disabled people are given more opportunities, then we could have more representation. And again, like I said, it's also about disabled people overcoming their own internalized ableism. Because if disabled people are not gunning for this kind of jobs, if they are not indicating interest to be, you know, to be able to tell their own stories themselves, to be script writers, for example, or to be in production, maybe the opportunities may never come. That's what I think.
Yeah. Elineka had her hand up.
Oh, thank you, Doctor. I wanted to add that maybe what we need to do is to make sure that we increase effort in advocating for persons with disability inclusion in each and every sector. Meaning that, for example, in the Tanzania context, I can see most of the initiatives or programs are focusing more on inclusion in education, for example, and some of the income generating activities, maybe also in politics. But there are other sectors which we have never, or we have not yet spent enough time to advocate for. So the most important thing is to believe that persons with disabilities can work or can be well included in each and every sector, and they can perform well. And coming to Datu's comment, yes, we believe that education is powerful in any sector, but we do have a number of actors who are doing very well based on their talent. So persons with disabilities can also take part in films without having a formal education on the same. Thank
you. I'm just wondering, I don't know if she's going to be up to it. I'm just wondering if Beth is able to share some of our recent research on Hollywood, new forms of representation of disabilities in Hollywood. I think there's one of your research where you observed that representation appeared to be changing and they appear to be more positive, but then they also seem to be, you know, edging towards patronizing disabled communities. So I don't know if you have something to say about that.
I finished my breakfast, so yes, I'm happy. Hi, everybody. I'm Beth Haller. I'm a 61-year-old white woman with very white hair that's very short. And yeah, I think in the States, there's a lot better representation happening on television because it's much more of a fluid medium. The business model for film is still very problematic to be changing, as Dan was talking about. You know, they film films very far in advance. It's all very secretive because they don't want stuff to get out. They're high insurance costs, so they want to keep the same people because it's millions of dollars if they change anybody. Not that I'm apologizing for the film industry in the US. It has major problems, but they are still functioning in an old world way, where I think television has adapted to streaming and new ways that audiences are getting the content. And that's been very beneficial for disabled actors and disabled creators. Like on Netflix, we have several disabled creators that have created, their own series, and we have documentaries about the Paralympics. A lot of the streaming platforms are curating disability content. Unfortunately, they're not indicating the difference between disabled people creating the content and, having people that are non-disabled representing disability, but mostly they're doing a pretty decent job, and a lot of them have accessibility coordinators. In fact, the accessibility coordinator and content coordinator for the NBC television network streaming platform in the US is called Peacock TV, is a disabled guy. So you're talking to somebody who gets it when you're talking to the person that's helping make sure that their content is accessible and representative of the disability community. But the problem was with streaming, the old stuff that wasn't made accessible, same with Netflix. But anyway, back to films. So they have this business model where they still believe that you need a big name star to get the people into the theater or the cinema spaces, which I don't think is true. And I've even found an article from a producer as far back as like 2012 saying that model is broken. We don't need to be using it anymore, especially now with streaming. Yes, there are blockbusters. There's Barbie, there's Oppenheimer, there's Transformers, whatever the superhero movie is of the week. Yes, people want to go to those kinds of movies in theaters, but I still think the pandemic showed us that there's a huge audience for streaming content. And a lot of people don't want to go to movies still, or don't have the time, like it's a way, if you have young children, you can stay home and watch movies. It's a way if you're tired after work and the model and structure of films here in the States are that, and this is supported by all the research about Hollywood openings and audiences of Hollywood films in the States, is the major audience is 12 to 25. So Hollywood films are primarily made for a very young audience. And I would guess a big portion of those audiences in the States, those young audiences, are like I was when I was a teenager. You're going to the movies not just to see the content, it's a social activity with a group of your friends. And it's kind of always been that way. It was the way in my generation, people just dropped their kids off the mall to go see the movies, and they could think that they were fairly safe, and they're with a bunch of other people. Anyway, so I think Hollywood is actually doing wrong by their audiences and the disability community, because if they would create content starring disabled people, I think they would see the support. My research very long ago showed that in the advertising world, when advertisers started using disabled models, this was back in the 1980s, companies like Target and other department stores could actually point to the purchases of the items modeled by disabled models. I mean, this was specifically in America, but it's kind of like the disability community here said, oh, you're representing our community authentically, because in the US, they actually have to hire disabled models for advertising because of our truth in advertising laws. So who thought advertising would kind of lead the way? But some people at some of these companies took note that these products were selling better because they had disabled models, because the disability community their friends and family in the US were purposely going out and buying that. They're kind of voting with their dollars on these products. Similarly, in Australia, my friend Katia Malaqua has gotten lots of the companies in Australia to start using disabled models. And she has a son with Down syndrome. So she called the CEOs of the companies in Australia and said, why aren't you hiring disabled models? They said, oh, we don't know how to find them. So she started her own database. She has a website that I would highly recommend. It's called Starting with Julius. And so, you know, there are these things happening that are getting disabled people. Teal Shearer, who I mentioned in the chat, is an actor and was in Hollywood, was trying to make it in Hollywood. And she's a wheelchair user. She was having trouble getting hired. But one of her big breaks was she started a national commercial for an insurance company that was actually supporting people to go vote. And so it really wasn't about insurance. It was about using your time to go make a difference by voting. But, you know, she couldn't book as many jobs as she wants. So she had been on this web series in the early days of YouTube and decided to shoot her own web series. So it's a two season series called My Gimpy Life. And people from all over the world have told me how important it is to be able to find this content on YouTube. And I think that's another location where we can all come together as a global community that's interested in media and disability to support people's work, to support it in streaming platforms that we get in a lot of different countries. You know, Netflix is in like over 150 countries, I think now. So, you know, I think we can be telling people who run these companies that we want content, but I'll stop and end on one negative note, which is I think Hollywood's way more ableist now because of the pandemic. I think they're actively stopping using disabled people in their films, especially because they see them as kind of a headache and they don't want to deal with the community. So they're just like keeping disabled characters out of the, I have nothing but anecdotal observations to base this on. I don't think Hollywood will sue me over just a blanket statement like this, but I really feel like and I saw them wanting to care back in January of 2020 when I was working with a major film studio. Now they don't care. One little story that's coming out in my book, it should be out in a couple of months. I'm actually proofing it this week. Anyway, the film Coda, somebody mentioned that in the chat, that has a number of deaf actors. The major film studio Lionsgate did not want to produce that film if it had deaf actors. So they, you know, didn't want it, even though the French version did not have deaf actors, but a very high up executive at Lionsgate said that's wrong. This is 2021. We can't be having films that don't have deaf or disabled actors in it. So he left and took the script with him and formed his own production company, worked with the director whose vision was to have the family be portrayed by deaf actors. She goes to the Academy Award-winning deaf actor Marlee Matlin and says, will you be in my film? She says, yes. But Marlee Matlin writes it into her contract that she is allowed to walk off the set of that movie if they hire hearing actors to play her family members in her deaf family. So, I mean, we're seeing little examples of power happening, but it's actually confronting the ableism and autism that's already in Hollywood. So I'm very concerned. I mean, this writer strike and the actor strike here in the States, you know, the Hollywood studios are pulling content from streaming platforms so they do not have to pay actors and writers. They're literally trying to starve them to death. The big issue is adding AI characters. So they're just going to, like, you know, not pay people and have AI computer generated humans in a lot of their films, especially in the background. You know, they haven't told Tom Cruise whether they're going to have a computer generated Tom Cruise yet, but it might be coming. And he's getting very upset if he's not getting his $1 billion payout.
I've heard from many UK producers as well, Beth, that they really don't know how to collaborate with people with disabilities, and that's why they are deterred from including them, and that's a real issue. So I wanted to ask Ngozi, how would you envisage your research to reach the media industry or to collaborate with filmmakers, your toolkit especially?
One of the things that we did during the second workshop, because during the first workshop we had filmmakers from the UK attend. So what I did during the second workshop was to have filmmakers, especially filmmakers from Nigeria, since the cinema that I studied was Nollywood. So I had these filmmakers attend, and yeah, one of the challenges they mentioned about was working. The filmmaker says this is his words. He said the logistics of having disabled people on set. And bearing in mind that, you know, movie ventures are very capitalist in nature, and Nollywood cinema, for example, they do not get government funding for their films. So it's a lot of independent filmmakers who sometimes have private funding from organizations and funders who are interested in making certain kinds of films, you know, or their own personal money that they use to fund or make this film. So he talked about how expensive it is to have disabled, you know, disabled actors on set. He was sharing experience about one time where he had a wheelchair user on set, and he talked about the cost of that and wondered if filmmakers would be willing to, you know, want to go the extra mile to have disabled people on set if they do not have, you know, budget to cover for them. So I also think it's, like you mentioned about collaborating between studios and funders as well, because I believe that if fund or capital is not the problem, then filmmakers would, you know, want to work together with disabled people. And again, also having stronger legislations about disability portrayal in films, for example, where, like Beth was talking about the advertising one in the US, where if you must, you know, represent any disabled person in advertising, then it must be a real life person with disability. So if we have stronger legislations around disability representation in films, it could also force the hands of filmmakers themselves, and then they have no choice in that instance to have a budget and include disabled actors in the logistics.
Okay. Any other question or comments?
There is one comment here. I think we would like to hear that. It says, from Kachem Young Initiative, it says, filmmaking can be a great advocacy tool for normalizing disability and inclusion. Nollywood, for instance, seems to almost always portray disability in a bad light, sending the wrong message about disability and telling a single story about persons with disabilities, which is often far from the current reality. Considering the demographic that constitutes their audience, these misconceptions penetrate the communities, which then translate or internalize it in different discriminatory ways. The media, advertising, and movie industries should be more deliberate in humanizing people with disabilities, telling a more balanced story of disability, and highlighting inclusion in between their plot as part of everyday life and growth.
Pratim, would you like to elaborate on that, or is it summing up? Okay. And Ngozi, would you like to
No,
comment on this?
I think this is a very, I mean, it's everything we've been talking about since we started this workshop. It's important to give disabilities a human face. It is important to naturalize and integrate disabilities into films in such a way that it is not separated apart and it's not seen as an inconvenience on screen. And is this achievable? Yes. And I think disabled people are one of the most important minority groups in the world today. They are not, it's not, you know, a small community, because sometimes people think, oh, how many people are disabled? It's a large community. It's a large community of people. And they deserve agential rights. They deserve a voice. They deserve balanced representation on screen. And I believe the more we advocate for these things and the more we talk about them, the more, you know, steps we take towards, you know, having that inclusion and having disabilities as an integral difference on screen.
We have here a comment from George. Large community estimated to be 1.4 billion.
Yes, it is. It is a large community.
We have a hands up from Rajab. Rajab?
Yes, hi all of you. I hope I'm well heard.
Yes.
My question or my comment is that we have been advocating for inclusion of PWDs in the film industry, but in one way or another, there has been also a certain moment where persons with disabilities are included and taking even the position within a film to portray a certain characteristic or to function in a certain character. But you find that person with disabilities themselves who are not even in such or are not even expert or are not even understanding what clearly is a certain character requires a person to do, accusing such person to be embarrassed, accusing such kind of a person to be discriminated regarding the area. For example, it was a few weeks ago in Tanzania, a person with disability had a theater and had to act or having wearing the pampers. So that kind of a situation made persons with disability, especially with albinism, saying they are supposed to saying the one who engaging such character to apologize and to ask for the apology to them for embarrassing their community, having a person with disability, with albinism, acting while wearing a pampers. So how can you comment? How can you actually see such kind of a thing or an attitude being against the advancement and development and portraying of the film, inclusion about persons with abilities, but also balancing between the way persons with disability themselves tend to interpret their engagements towards the characters, toward the characteristics a character must portray to suit his or her position. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajab.
Rajab, I think one of the things that should matter is not about, you know, plots or films dancing to the tune of everyone's positionality, not even, you know, dancing to the tune of what different disability groups or organizations want. I think this is where standardization come into place, like I was talking about having the right legislations in place. When you have legislations that stipulate how different disabilities, for example, should be portrayed in films to be representative, to be fair, and to be balanced, then filmmakers ought to follow such, for example, and not just, represent disabilities in a way that suits one community of disabled people and not the other, for example. If we continue to have, just opinions and feelings, and remember, like I said in the beginning of my presentation, some disabled people are also guilty of enabling ableist gaze. They are also guilty of being in that ableist position, especially when you consider there is an unconscious and unseen hierarchy of disabilities, even amongst the disabled community. So I think what could make this kind of situation that you explained a bit better, especially when the communities involved themselves, is having a form of standardization, a legislation that, stipulates just what to do. I don't know. I don't know if Dan or Beth has anything to add to that.
Beth or Dan, if you would like to add?
I think it's helpful if the disability community is just in constant conversation with filmmakers, TV networks, whatever the media is, and whatever country you're in. You have to make them know that you care about the representation. There's been so much in the US where people complain about the problems, but now with social media, it's really helpful to tweet about it, or X, whatever we're calling X about it. Do a Facebook video about it, do a YouTube video about the problems you see. You will get the attention. Networks and producers and filmmakers do not like negative comments. So they will try to engage. And like I said, reach out to anybody you know that is working on accessibility, because I feel like it's not just about technical accessibility. Having stigmatizing content is making a film or TV show inaccessible to those of us that are anti-ableists. And so I think if we can get that into the minds of, the creators that are non-disabled of this content, that is very helpful. And do expect some backlash, like I was talking about. I think some production companies will just like write out disabled characters, but others will listen to you. So I think, and I think now is a particularly important time too, because they've gone back to really old ways in a bad way because of the pandemic. So now they're trying to recoup the billions of dollars that they lost from people not going to theaters. But movie sales were down in the US long before the pandemic, like 10 years before the pandemic. So they're blaming the pandemic for what was already a problem in the US cinema, at least. So I think it's just another area of advocacy that I haven't seen as many disability groups doing, and that's media advocacy. Because I've been doing this a long time, since the early 90s. And a lot of the disability groups didn't know at that point how important media was going to be. And so they're just like, oh, we got to work on these other issues. And my response always was, what are you going to do without public opinion on your side? Now that the general public has much more access to disability images through streaming platforms, they're in lots of countries, independent filmmakers being able to put their disability created content on YouTube and other platforms, TikTok and everything else. I think people are able to demand that. And I think the non-disabled audiences want it. They want authenticity, because I've had people without disabilities like be in shock when they hear that that actor was not disabled, and they're like, forget about that. No. And especially the younger generation does not want fake disabled people in their TV and film. They really value authenticity. And I think the Hollywood and other places are very behind the times, because young people, I think, understand how important it is that all of our communities are represented in our media, because we have so many billions of ways to access all this media content. And people in other countries, I worked with a group in Serbia a few years back, and they said Facebook and other social media have been a godsend, because they can see what the disability activists in the US and other countries are doing, and then model some of their activities on there. And so they got involved with media activities because of seeing that that was important, and bringing disability rights films over and screening them in their country. So I think that's another way you can be proactive and have your own kind of disability film festivals. And like even when I teach, if I work with people, some of my students actually work with disabled people, I said, just have your organization have on some Friday night or Saturday night your own little disability film festival, in your seminar room, in your organization, and screen some interesting content. I think it'll get everybody going, like, oh, who do we know in our community who's making films or TV or writing scripts? And, I think that creating that dialogue between the disabled media creators and their own disability community, because they're out there trying to apply their writing or creating their films in a non-disabled world, because I think a lot of them don't feel supported in the disability community, because the disability community hasn't necessarily embraced film and television as a way to communicate about their groups, individual disability groups, because the mainstream media has done such a bad job. But that's not a reason to give up on media. So I think disability organizations in every country, grassroots organizations in every country need to be creating their own media or partnering with disabled people who are already media creators, and just flood the marketplace. I mean, this is also how a lot of mainstream media find their content. I mean, we can point to lots and lots of shows and music people who were discovered on YouTube. Let's have that happen for lots of disabled media creators. It's not going to happen unless we create the content and put it out there. So I think we can all join together as a global disability community and support people, getting their content out there.
Yeah, I agree.
And people have a video creation device right there in their hand. There's actually more concentration of smartphones, I think, in African countries than in the rest of the world. So because some of the technology in between telephones, the old-fashioned telephones, the infrastructure wasn't there. So now with satellite technologies for mobile phones, you have a video creation device, that you can more easily get access for. I'll give a shout out to a journalist I'm mentoring in Kenya who has a show on Science TV in Nairobi, and it's a show for a network that is majority disabled people. So everything has sign language interpretation. There's lots of focus on disability content, and 60% of the employees are persons with disabilities. So, there are these places where we're seeing disability content. And the reason I interviewed the creator of the network for my book, the reason he started Science TV in Nairobi is because his sister is deaf and he works in advertising. And he said, this is wrong. He wants to be able to sit down and watch a TV show with his sister. And there wasn't any. And the way the Kenyan broadcast system worked, he was not able to get them to, you know, add interpretation or captions or whatever he thought they should do to make it more accessible. So he just started his own network, and he found, you know, international funds that support people with disabilities. And so it was actually to his economic advantage to have a majority of his employees be persons with disabilities. So there's funding out there for international disability initiatives that he was able to tap into. And so, you know, it's like a win-win. And you're getting disability content, you're employing disabled people. And Alan Herbert, you can find him in several different platforms. He's training disabled people in Nairobi to shoot their own video using this little device right here, you know, and telling their own stories. If they can't get into the mainstream media in Kenya, they're going to shoot their own stories, distribute them on WhatsApp and other platforms. And, you know, and journalists look at that. Yeah. What's happened in the US is journalists will look on social media and on, you know, other video platforms and look at story ideas. You know, like we've seen a total change. People are still thinking about the news media here in a very old way in the US. But getting, I mean, we had a major loss of journalists in the US ever since the internet came in. We're talking like a third of journalists no longer exist in the US. But what that did was open up a space in news organizations for disability content. So they run so many opinion columns from disability community, let people freelance for them. They're not hiring necessarily a ton of disabled journalists, but a Disabled Journalists Association is coming soon. A friend of mine in the US is starting an International Disabled Journalists Association. But journalists say they are out on Twitter, Facebook, all the TikTok, all the social media sites, finding stories, finding sources with disabilities. So it's been a boon. So you just need to be out there creating the media. So, and then I'll tell you what will really get you media attention. If you're not in a non-US country and you get US media covering you, then suddenly the journalists in your country are very interested about why the US media is covering your country. Or if some video from your country goes viral, you know, media from around the world are looking, you know, even just like a YouTube video that goes viral or a Facebook video that goes viral, and they want to talk about that and they will highlight that video. So that's what's awesome. And Alan also has an organization you might be interested in. He has albinism, and it's an organization called Black Albinism, and they're doing a lot of advocacy work to make sure people with albinism are treated fairly and in a human rights oriented way.
Can I just add to that Beth has an entire website on social activism, which we, with the toolkits, several course modules, which is fantastic. And it's on our website. It's linked on our website and in the WhatsApp chat. So anyone interested in that, please have a look.
It's a little old now, but it's still
great. It's still great. Okay. Are there any final questions or comments?
I think there's a question in the chat.
Okay, I didn't see that one.
By Katumba, yeah.
Where is it? Can you see it, Ngozi?
Yeah, it's
George. He's actually left now, George, I think.
Katumba.
Oh, how can disabled people break through the film industry knowing well that it's profit-oriented and disability inclusion requires reasonable accommodation? I think that's a huge question that may not be able to.
Using the words of the Americans with Disabilities Act, I like that. Yeah, I think that is a big issue. And there are already lots and lots of people with disabilities working in Hollywood, but they have hidden disabilities, most of them, and are hiding that because they want to keep their job. But so we've got to break that kind of way that people, and the majority of people with disabilities actually have non-visible disabilities. So that's the majority of people. So it's not somebody using a wheelchair with a white cane. So they probably don't feel comfortable speaking up. But I think the profit-oriented question is really important. So when I was giving a talk to Lionsgate Film Studio back in January of 2020, one of the business side people asked me that question. She's like, well, what are we supposed to do if we want to acquire a film at Sundance Film Festival and they haven't used disabled actors for a disabled character? I said, I know if you think that's going to be a good film for you to distribute under your name, that yes, you're probably going to lose a little money in the short run if you reject that film because it hasn't used authentic casting. But I said, if you were willing as a major film studio to say to that filmmaker that we are not buying your film at Sundance because you did not hire disabled actors, within minutes, that statement from a film studio executive or acquirement person would flash across the world. And suddenly the word would be among every independent filmmaker on the planet Earth that major film studios are not acquiring films if you don't hire disabled actors.
Ngozi, would you like to comment on this? Did this emerge in your research or in your workshops, this final points? Very briefly, because we're running out of time.
Oh, yeah. I mean,
Sorry, can I ask everyone to mute themselves, please? Sorry, Ngozi.
No worries. It's one of the concerns that, participants expressed during the co-production of the two kids. How cinemas are very capitalist in nature, and how, do we accommodate disabled people in cinema production, the entire, cinema world. And I think one of the things that Beth mentioned about is also one of the ways that disabled people from West Africa, for example, are beginning to employ to kind of have access into the industry. And what they are doing now is to make their own films. For example, during my research, the interviews and focus groups I did for my for my PhD, I had about 2 disability groups, disability organizations who have made films, on disabilities, how they want disabilities to be represented in Nollywood. And they shared those films with me. So what they are doing now is to make their own films and, distribute their own films into the market as a way of gaining access into Nollywood. So I think one of the ways to combat this is to carry on making their own films with their cell phones, like Beth said.
Yeah. Okay. I'm afraid we have to wrap up, but we can continue this dialogue in the WhatsApp group. And I think, Ngozi, you are in the WhatsApp group, aren't you? So if anyone has further questions or comments, they can put it.
No, I'm not in a WhatsApp
Oh,
group.
you are not? Okay, well then maybe people can email you. And yes, thank you so much.
I'm going to leave my email in the chat. So
Perfect.
Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you.
Join the WhatsApp group, Ngozi. Join the WhatsApp group.
I can leave my phone number as well.
It's a very lively group. It's a very lively group, so it will be much appreciated. But thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your important and really, really fascinating research with us. Thank you very much to the audience for being that interactive. And Ngozi's toolkit features on our website in the resource section. And our next webinar, as then announced, is in September, and we'll announce it shortly. And have a wonderful day and see you next time. All the best. Thank you very much.
Thank you.